Today is February 16th, 2004. I'm interviewing James P. Hurst at his home in Andover, Connecticut. Interviewer is Eileen Hurst Downey from Central Connecticut State University. James Hurst is my uncle. Jim, will you tell me your birth date, your current address, and what war you were in?
My birth date is February 25th, 1925. And my present address is 746 East Street, Andover, Connecticut. And I was in World War II.
What branch of the service were you in, and what was your rank?
I was a first lieutenant in the Army Air Force. When I went in, it was the Army Air Corps, but then they changed it to the Army Air Force.
And where did you serve?
Well, in training, it was all down in the southern part of the country, the United States. But I went overseas and flew my combat missions out of Italy.
Were you drafted, or did you enlist?
No, I enlisted. My mother didn't want me to enlist in the Air Force. She thought that was kind of dangerous. So I kept telling her that if I wait until I get drafted, I'll be put in the infantry. So I got her to sign my enlistment papers. I was only 17 when I enlisted, and took the examinations and so on.
Because you were 17, you had to have your parents sign?
Right, I had to have my mother, or my father died, but my mother had to sign for me, yes.
Where were you living at the time?
I was living in West Hartford.
Why did you join?
Oh, since I was 10 years old, or earlier even, I always wanted to fly. And this was my opportunity. I remember I've made dozens of airplane models and all kinds of things when I was a kid. I used to run around with propellers that I hand carved, you know, making them, pretending I was an airplane. And so I always wanted to fly. And at that time, you had to have either 2 years of college or you had to pass an examination. And so I went down and took the examination and passed with flying colors. In fact, he told me I got the second highest score in the state of Connecticut.
Wow.
Of all the kids that had taken the test. Anyway, I was just tickled to death. I was going to be a pilot. I thought.
Do you recall your first days in service?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell me what that was like?
Well, we left Hartford by train and went up to Camp Fort Devens in Massachusetts. That was some kind of an assembly area thing. And I remember the very first thing I remember is that all I could smell was that coal gas that they used. They used to heat the barracks with coal. And God, the whole field, the whole base had that coal gas smell, you know. But anyway, then from there I went by train to Biloxi, Mississippi. No Pullman coaches or no Pullman cars on this train. It was all coaches, and you sat up all the whole way. And I remember the guys were sleeping on the floor and on their barracks bags, and they had thrown a whole bunch of barracks bags out between the cars out on the platform. And I thought, hell, that's a good place to sleep. Except nobody was there, and I couldn't figure out why no one else had that idea. And so I went outside, and I sacked up out on the barracks bags between the cars, and I woke up the next morning, I was covered with coal dust. Everybody else was smart enough not to sleep out there. And I got all that coal. Anyway, I went down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and this was in March. I was inducted.
What year?
1943. I was inducted in March 27th, so it was still pretty cold up here, and it was nice and warm down there at Keesler Field.
And is that where you did your basic?
Well, that was just basic Army training, basic infantry kind of training. We learned to march, and we learned to shoot the rifle and the .45 pistol and you know, that kind of stuff. But one thing I remember about that, we had these huge parades on the air base where they parked the airplanes. Big open space there, and I loved it. I thought that was the greatest thing on wheels. Loved all those parades and the bands and everything else, you know.
And how long were you there?
Just a month.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
No, these were just regular GI instructors. I don't have a clue as to who they were. But I do remember a couple things about that place. We ate in a big open tent mess hall. It wasn't a building at all. It was just a big tent. And the food wasn't all that great. I remember that. but they served me one morning grits, you know, the grits, and I thought it was cream of wheat. Of course, I think this is true of every northerner that ever went down south. And of course, I put sugar and cream on it. But they also served me some cold sausage, and it made me sick. And I couldn't eat sausage for 30 years after that. But the other thing I remember about that is that they had a big scare down there of spinal meningitis. And several kids got it and died, and we were all kind of panicky about that spinal meningitis, but thank God nobody in our barracks got it. And from there, we went to the University of Massachusetts, what they call College Training Detachment. And this was a new wrinkle, I guess, that they introduced to give the pilots some more finishing. You know, we studied physics, and we studied geography, and you know, sort of college level courses, and that, you know, that took up another 3 months of our training. It wasn't too bad, except this was during the summer months up at University of Massachusetts, and there weren't any girls there, so from that point of view, it wasn't so good. But the other good thing about it, though, was that I was only 50 miles from home. And so they gave us a few weekends off, so I was able to go home and see my mother and my brothers and sisters.
Did you go to UMass with a group of pilots? Or
well, at this point, they're all aviation students. They're not even cadets yet. And we're like privates in the Army. And this is all preliminary to finding out whether you're going to be a pilot and that sort of thing. After the University of Massachusetts, by the way, I did very well there too, scholastically. But anyway, after that, I went to Nashville, Tennessee for classification. And they gave us a whole bunch of tests, you know, mental tests and physical tests, physical coordination tests, to try to determine whether or not you were going to be a pilot or a bombardier or a navigator. And you know, the test that I had no problem with at all, of course, and I ended up being classified as a pilot trainee, a pilot aviation cadet. I had a little scare, though, because the doctor that first examined me, they give you a very, very intense physical examination. And the doctor that examined me thought he heard a heart murmur. And so they sent me to a heart specialist that they had down there, and to see if I really did. So I get over there the next day, and he has me jumping up and down and that sort of thing. And he listens to my heart, and he says, "You haven't got a damn heart murmur." He said, "If that idiot sends me another one of these things," then of course I floated out of the room. Yeah, because that would have killed me. I would have been out of the Air Force entirely. I'd have been a gunner or something probably. But anyway, not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not what I wanted to be. So then I was classified as a pilot. I went to to pre-flight, they called it, at Maxwell Field, Alabama, Montgomery. And that was a whole bunch of more classes, no flying. This is all ground school. And you learn, again, you learn some more things about flying, the basics of flying, and the theory of flight, and what makes an airplane fly, and things like Morse code. We had to go to Morse code school and stuff like that. A lot more marching, and a lot more parades, which I loved. And some years later, I went down to visit Maxwell as part of our squadron reunion. Had their reunion down there, and I went back and I saw the old mess hall and where I did my KP. No, actually, I didn't really, but where we ate and stuff, and really something. It hadn't changed all that much. It really hadn't. It was, of course, it was an old permanent field then. It was one of the old-time Air Force fields, and so it wouldn't really change much because the buildings were permanent and so on.
Now, your training at Maxwell was just for pilots?
Yes,
you were
just
all pilots?
All pilots, all pilots.
And you still hadn't gotten into an airplane?
Well, when I was in college training, one of the things they did was they gave us 10 hours in a Piper Cub, just to see if they had any skill at all. So I had already had a few hours of training, but no real training, no real Air Force training. Leaving Maxwell Field.
How long did you stay in Maxwell?
2 months. I tell you an interesting story about that, though. They used to have a graduation dance for the cadet. There were two classes there at the same time, 44D and 44E. I was in 44E, which is, my graduating class would be the month of May in 1944, so that's how they identified your class, 44E. So they had, when I got there, 44D, the class ahead of me, was in the second month of their training. And so the first month was you know, kind of basic stuff, but we had to do guard duty the night, I had to do guard duty the night they had their graduation dance, 44D. And so I'm marching up and down, right next to they had a big open area of concrete and stuff that they held the dances on, and with a bandstand, you know, kind of thing. And I'm marching up and down, and all these guys are dancing with these good-looking chicks, and good-looking girls in Alabama, by the way. And so I thought, hey, that's pretty neat. So when it was our turn to have our graduation dance, I thought, I'll get me a gal. And what they had was some kind of a file on girls that had indicated their willingness to go to these dances. And so I went over to the place where they had this file, and I wanted a Catholic, blonde, blue-eyed girl, and they found me one. And so they gave me her phone number and all, and I was supposed to call her up and invite her to the dance. And I couldn't get up enough nerve. And I kept thinking, I'll call her up, but then what am I going to say? You know, I never did call, and I never went to the damn dance. Anyhow, then from there I went to primary flight school at Palmer Field in Bennettsville, Georgia. Bennettsville, South Carolina, rather. I'm sorry. And there I started to fly. And we were flying the old PT-17, which is a biplane, 2 wings, open cockpit. And we dressed in these heavy leather sheepskin-lined flying suits, no heated flying suit or anything, in an open cockpit. And this was, of course, in the fall of 1943. And it got fairly cool down there at that time. And this went on, I think I arrived there, sometime around late October or so. And we were there for about 2 months, and so that took us over, into the December era. and it got pretty chilly. I loved it though. I thought that was the greatest thing on wheels, and I had no problems at all. I had a great instructor. His name was Gupton from Lewisburg, North Carolina. And in fact, I wrote, he asked us when we left to write to him and tell him, you know, where we were and stuff. And I wrote to him every place I went, every base I went.
Rank?
He's a civilian. The primary schools were, at least the ones I went to, the one I went to, was run by I think they called themselves the Georgia Air Service or something. It was a civilian operated school. All the pilots were, the instructors were civilians. They had a major who ran the base, that is the Army part of it. He was really the boss of the cadets and stuff. And they had a couple of instructors from the Air Force who gave check rides. That is, they were the ones who would take every student up before he graduated to make sure that he really knew how to fly. So, but the ones who gave you the day-to-day instruction were all civilians. So he was a civilian, Mr. Gupton. Great guy.
And how long were you in South Carolina?
Every one of these flight training things is about 2 months or so. I remember that there's an interesting thing about that was I went back to see that place again a few years back, and it's no longer a field. Of course, it was an old onion field before they planted grass seed, and there were no runways. You just landed on this big open field any old way you wanted. I mean, you could land on one side or the other side. And in fact, there were planes coming in all over the place. When you flew, there could be a plane 50 feet over landing at the same time, you know. And sometimes they weren't going in the same direction as you, and as you got down the field, he kept getting closer and closer. That, you know, that kind of thing. It was kind of scary. You think about it now, and I thought, God, that could have been pretty scary. But never any wrecks or anything. So, but anyway, getting back to the visit I made a few years ago, it is now a state penitentiary for South Carolina. They built a new penitentiary right out in the middle of the field. Of course, it's got big open fields all the way around it. And the place where the hangars were, and the barracks, that apparently was sold to a farm machinery manufacturer, and they now make cotton equipment. That is, equipment to harvest cotton or whatever down there. So, kind of takes the romance out of going back to see your old base. And from there, we went to Sumter, Shaw Field, which is now still an Army Air Base. They have F-16s down there now.
And what did you learn there?
And that was, you then switched to a more powerful plane. This is the consolidated Vultee BT-13, which was an enclosed cockpit, and it had a radio in it now. And now we started, the other one didn't even have a radio. Now you started talking to the tower and getting instructions on when to take off and so on. Runways, you landed on a regular runway. It's a regular airfield. And the instruction became much more intense at that point. You began to, it wasn't just a matter of learning to fly the plane. You had to learn to fly it the way the Army wanted you to fly it. You had to be very precise in what you did, and you couldn't just land anywhere on the runway. You had to land at this particular spot on the runway, you know, that sort of thing. And the whole thing began to get much more intense, and a lot of guys started to wash out at this point. Some of them did in primary. Some of these guys just either they were afraid to fly or just didn't hack it for some reason.
Was it the same group of guys that you stayed with throughout the whole?
Yeah, pretty much, as a matter of fact. In fact, one of the guys that I was with in primary went to every single field that I went to after that, and he ended up next door to me in my squadron in Italy. His name was Dick Bodycomb, And he ended up as a major general. He stayed in. He ended up as a major general in charge of the whole Army Air Force Reserve. So I got connections.
Where did you go from Shaw Field?
From Shaw, we went to that was called basic. From Shaw, we went to our advanced flight training at Turner Field in Albany, Georgia, Jimmy Carter's hometown. And that was another nice field. Now here, I began to. They had decided along the way. They kept asking, "What do you want to fly?" And I wanted to fly the P-38. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Of course, at 6'3", 200 pounds, there aren't too many 6'3", 200-pound fighter pilots.
Why, are they usually small?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, believe it or not, the distance between your brain and your heart is a factor on how much G-forces you can stand. Because what happens when you turn a fighter plane rapidly, you know, the blood is forced out of your brain. It's just centrifugal force. And the distance that your heart has to pump it to your brain is a factor in how well you can stand G-forces. So short guys have a shorter distance between their brain and their heart. And plus the fact that some cockpits are kind of small. I remember trying to get into a P-39 cockpit one time. I couldn't even get in. I mean, it was just too damn small for me. P-38 had a nice big cockpit, but anyway, and of course I think bigger people have slower reaction times probably and stuff. So every place you go, they ask you what you want to fly, and I kept writing P-38, and I kept sort of giving the clue to my instructors that I wanted to fly P-38. So they used to say P-38, but when I got to a basic, they decided I was more bomber pilot material. And so they sent me to twin engine school, and Turner Field was a twin engine plane school. The first month I flew an AT-10, which is just a, you know, you see them around here now, those little twin engine AT-10, yeah, Advanced Trainer 10. And that went on for the first month, and I had no problems with that either. That just duck soup. And apparently they thought I must have some skill because they took certain members of the class and they put them into B-25s. It was a stripped down version of the bomber, but this was a regular, honest to God bomber that the Air Force was using right then in combat. And they were, I guess it was an experiment to see whether these young kids could with that much training, could handle a B-25. And so here I was, 19 years old, just turned 19 years old, flying around in a B-25. And oh, I tell you, I thought I was the hottest thing you ever saw in your life. But I really enjoyed that down there. I had a really tough instructor. He never smiled, never gave you any credit. Everything you did was wrong. But you know, I think, thinking back on it now, I think he was trying to keep the pressure on you, because when you got to combat, you had all kinds of pressure. And if you couldn't handle him, how the hell are you going to handle combat?
Was he a civilian or military?
No, he was military. He was military.
Do you remember his name?
No, I don't. I remember his voice, though, yelling at me, you know. But, there's several things about that place I remember very well. We had a cross-country flight one time. Of course, we flew a lot by ourselves down there, too. We weren't always with an instructor. And we had a cross-country flight at night, a night cross-country flight, from Montgomery up to Birmingham, down to Mobile, Alabama, and then back to, not Montgomery, from Albany up to Birmingham, down to Mobile, Alabama, and across back to Albany again. And of course down south, and this was in probably April or so, they start to get a lot of thunderstorms, and a lot of thunderstorms at night. And I had another student as a co-pilot, but he had actually some time in the Air Force before that. He had been in the Air Force as a gunner in the South Pacific, and he had transferred or had gotten an opportunity to go into cadets to become a pilot. So anyway, we were flying, and as we got from Birmingham down to Mobile, we started to see all these big thunderheads all over the place. You couldn't see them really. All you could see was the lightning, and it just scared you. I mean, it's just terrible. It's just all over the place. You don't know. You don't know where you are. You can't see the ground. You know. Anyway, we finally made it. But of the group that had taken off that night to fly this cross country, half of them had landed somewhere else. They never even got back to the base. But he was saying that's as scary as anything he's ever seen in combat. It was that bad. The other thing I remember is one flight we had an instructor in the lead plane, and we were flying formation, 3 planes, and I had another student, aviation cadet, with me in my plane, and we were flying low altitude cross country. And of course, down there, a lot of open spaces, the Okefenokee Swamp, you know, there's nothing there. And so we're buzzing along about 100 feet off the ground, and every once in a while you'd run across a house. And all I could think of was those poor people. This is 7 to 8 o'clock in the morning. Those poor people are still in bed, some of them, and they got bounced out of the bed by these 3 B-25s coming across. Oh, but it was fun. For a 19-year-old kid flying cross country at 100 feet off the ground, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I'll tell you. Anyway, a lot of good memories of Albany. Met a friend of my brother's who was an instructor pilot down there. Lived about 4 houses from where I was born. And he was a captain, and he was a fighter pilot instructor at another base in that area. So then from there, when I graduated, that's where I got my wings.
Turner?
At Turner Field. Became a 2nd lieutenant. That's another thing. At that point, they were making some people flight officers. That is, you weren't really a commissioned officer, and they had a lot of, you wouldn't call them tests so much, I guess, but you had to be interviewed by a colonel to see whether you had, I don't know, officer presence or something, and
Apparently you did.
and I could, well, you know, I did. I must have. Yeah, I got to be a 2nd. But what I couldn't understand is that afterward, you know, you talk to these other guys about comparing notes. What did they ask you? You know, that kind of. And he didn't ask me very much, you know. And I thought, oh, he's already decided I'm going to be a flight officer. No point wasting my time with this guy. And I guess it was that I must have had officer presence or something, because he said they didn't ask me very much. They must have decided right off the bat that I qualified as an officer. And here I'm only 19 years old, you know. I couldn't really. I couldn't pretend to be an adult when you're only 19. So then I got my wings and went home on leave and came back to, I was reassigned then back again to Maxwell Field to learn to fly the B-24. I had been assigned to the B-24. Now there's another thing. If I couldn't fly P-38s, I wanted to fly A-20s, which is a twin-engine attack plane, and didn't get that either. I got my B-24. So I learned at Maxwell. I learned to fly the B-24 plane, no problems. The progression, the Air Force training was, I think, just outstanding. The progression from one level of plane to a more difficult plane to a more powerful plane, and every phase of the training you tried they gave you emergency situations so that if anything happens, this is what you do, you know. And believe it or not, even in combat, where I lost engines and I had engines shot out and all that kind of stuff, I always knew what to do because I had already practiced that so many times with my instructors and stuff, all the way back. The training was just outstanding. I remember one thing about that emergency reminds me. When I was in primary flight training, they had a deal where you'd be flying around, and your instructor would suddenly cut the engine, pull the throttle back. It's an emergency landing, you know, your engine quit. And so you had to look around and find a hayfield or someplace that was open where you could land it. And I found this big field, and I started going down toward it, and I looked down, and here's this farmer down there with his mule out there cultivating his cotton. And I thought, oh my God. Well, of course, it's only practice, and when you get down low enough, the instructor would put on the power and you'd just take off again. But this poor guy heard this plane, he looked up and he heard this plane pop, 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 and, you know, sputtering along, and it's coming right at him, and he just took off. He ran across that field going like hell, left the mule out in the middle of the field. And of course the instructor put on the power and we took off again. Well, I didn't do it on purpose. That was the biggest field I could find, and you know, I wanted to land where it was nice and easy. But the instruction was just wonderful. And I had no, as you progressed, it was such that I never seemed to have any problem with going to the next more powerful, more complicated machine. And there, of course, we did a lot more things with the B-24. We got into more formation flying and really close formation flying, and night navigation and all those kinds of things. And that was another couple of months or so. That was the summer of 1944. Hotter than the blazes down there in Montgomery. Gee. I had to change my uniform like 3 or 4 times a day. You'd be so soaking with no air conditioning, just soaking with perspiration. Really a hot place.
And then where did you go?
Then I went to a place. I went to Lincoln, Nebraska. I went home on leave after that again. I went back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that was where I picked up my crew. This now, from this point on, all my training was with my crew. See, I'm now a qualified pilot, and now we have to learn to fly as a crew. So I went to Lincoln, Nebraska, where I picked up my co-pilot and my navigator and my bombardier and so on. And
how many men in a crew?
well, normally there are 10. But when I got overseas, I didn't really need a navigator because we're always in formation. And in many cases, I didn't even need a bombardier because all we did was just, when the plane up front dropped its bombs, we dropped our bombs. So you didn't always have the 10 men on your crew when you were flying. But normally there'd be 10 men. There'd be a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, and then 6 gunners, an engineer, a radio operator, and then some gunners. I had a good crew. I really did. I had a wonderful co-pilot. Part of the problem of some pilots had was that their co-pilot really wasn't very good. That is, he could fly, but he really wasn't at the same level as the pilots, perhaps. In fact, my co-pilot had never flown a B-24. I had to teach him how to fly a B-24. He had just graduated from flight school, twin-engine flight school, but had no real big plane experience.
Do you remember his name?
Oh yeah, Clyde Dubbs.
Dubbs?
D-U-B-B-S. He is from Pennsylvania. He's a Pennsylvania Dutchman, I suspect. And
Didn't you train with the crew at Lincoln, Nebraska?
no, Lincoln, you just picked up your crew, and then we went to Tucson, Arizona, to Davis Mountain Air Base out there, airfield. And that's where we trained as a crew. And from then on, we never had an instructor aboard. We had check riders, that is, guys would come guys, I can tell you about this later, but from then on, you're a crew. You are in command of the airplane, and you fly as a crew. And if you need an instructor aboard, at this point, you better start over again, because you're not going to hack it when you get into combat. So anyway, we were flying as a crew, great crew. I had a super engineer, first-class radio operator. I couldn't have asked for a better bunch.
And from there, did you go overseas as a crew?
Yeah, that's right. From that point on, that's your crew. Everything you do from then on. And then, of course, this was all kinds of training, formation flying, bombing. We did some. I had a bombardier now, and so we did some practice bombing. Formation flying was like we would practice bombing. I remember the big dams out there, the Imperial Dam and the Parker Dam, where at Las Vegas, we bombed that thing all to hell with a camera, of course. But you practice your bomb runs and stuff. And a couple of times, I know we flew over to San Diego from Tucson, which isn't too far away, and we had a mock interception by some Marine fighter pilots. And I'll tell you, they scared the hell out of us, because they went right down through the formation. I mean, the guy you're flying on, there was a Corsair or whatever, would go right down between you and the guy you're flying on. So it was really, but it was to sort of introduce you to the idea that this is what's going to happen when you get into combat. This is all combat training. And we had fighter planes come in, and our gunners shot plastic bullets at them. And these were, what the heck do they call them? P-63 King Cobras. They were they were like a P-39, but they were a bigger version of it. And they put armor plate around them, and so you hit them with these plastic bullets. And my plane had a different color plastic bullet, they told me anyway, and they could tell which plane had hit so you're actually firing a bullet at a real airplane. It wasn't, and of course we fired they used to have target sleeves go by and that kind of stuff. But it was really, they tried to make it as realistic as possible. And we had, the other thing, of course, was right next to the University of Arizona. And I'll tell you, they got some lovely looking girls at the University of Arizona. And so we had a kind of an active social life. I had lost some of my bashfulness, by the way, by this time. I wasn't afraid to call up a girl at this time, and like I was in pre-flight. Well, hell, I was almost 20 years old at this point. Oh, yes.
And did you go from Tucson overseas?
Yeah, we went from Tucson. I went to Topeka, Kansas, and I don't know what the point of that was, to tell you the truth, because I had my crew and everything, and we stayed there for a few days, and then we finally went to Camp Patrick Henry in Newport News, Virginia, and took a ship, the SS Argentina, to Italy.
Where did you land in Italy?
We landed in Naples, Italy. And on the way over, we had it pretty good. My crew, we went over, the pilot, the officers, had the upper staterooms. Of course, they put, I don't know, 10 or 12 officers in one room. They had bunks and stuff, but at least it was up above, and pretty decent. The poor enlisted men, they were down in the hold of the thing, and they had these canvas bunks things, and in between this bunk and this bunk, they had about 1.5 feet, and so you had to sort of slide in sideways. And I used to go down and see my crew every day. I'd go down and spend some time with them. But they also had some 10th Mountain Division. The Air Force guys never got seasick. That's the same thing as air sickness. And once you've gotten over that initial hump, you know, they never got seasick. But we had, I don't know, 5,000 10th Mountain Division guys on board, and boy, they did get seasick. And you would go down to that hold, and all you could smell was that seasickness. I mean, and they couldn't get out. I mean, they couldn't see. So they assigned me as assistant mess officer. My job, they had built these 2 ladders into the main dining room. Beautiful ship, by the way. This used to run between New York and South America before the war. Big passenger ship. And they built these 2 ladders down into the main dining room. And so the troops would come down. And my job, and they had them set up so that this company and whatever, this regiment, whatever it was, would eat at a certain time, and so on, so on. So, and they all had badges, and they had colored badges. So all the red ones went before the green ones and whatever. So my job as assistant mess officer was to stand at the bottom of this damn ladder and see that they were coming in the right order. And to tell you the truth, I didn't give a damn whether they were in the right order or not. I really, you know, what am I going to do about it? The guy's in the wrong, get out of here, go on back. Baloney. But there was the second lieutenant from the 10th Mountain who did pay attention to that. And he was at the other side of the ladder. And, oh God, he used to chew those guys out, yell at them. And I thought to myself, you're a nut. I mean, what the hell difference does it make? You know, as long as you essentially, I don't know. Anyway, that was my job as assistant mess officer. I met a kid from New Haven in the 10th Mountain, by the way, and apparently he had 1 jacket too many or something, and they were going to have some kind of an inspection, and he thought he was going to lose this jacket, so he found out I was from Connecticut. He came up to my room and he gave me a 10th Mountain Division jacket, which I still have.
Wow.
I still have it. It's a little tight on me now.
Where were you located in Italy? Because then you flew your missions out of Italy? Yeah,
well, we landed in Naples, and just before Christmas. And I spent Christmas 1944 in Naples. You know, a little town outside called Caserta, which, by the way, is where the Pope has his summer house.
How do you spell it?
Caserta. And we stayed there for a few days, and finally caught a train to Canosa di Puglia, which is about 1/3 of the way up the boot of Italy, sort of on the other side, away from Naples. And these were boxcars. They weren't coaches or anything else. These were old freight cars. And we were sitting in the railroad yard there at Caserta, and next door was a train with some bales of straw on it. And so there were, I don't know, 2 or 3 crews in our boxcar. And somebody got the bright idea to get some of this straw and bring it over into our thing, and would sleep on the straw instead of sleeping on the floor. So they brought the straw over and they spread it around, and we were on the damn train 36 hours. It was only 75 miles away, and we were on the train 36 hours. And it was cold. This was in the end of December of 1944. And that, by the way, was when the Battle of the Bulge was going on, and there's a huge cold wave all over Europe at that time, colder than they've had for years and years. And then they decided that it's so cold in here, we ought to light a fire. Can you imagine these idiots? They lit a fire with a freight car full of straw. loose straw yet. Anyway, they lit a fire at the other end, not at my end, and not my crew, I'll tell you that. And they burned a hole in the floor of the wooden floor. They burned it right down through the floor. So anyway, one thing I remember about that trip, though, especially, was it would go along about 2 or 3 miles an hour, and it would stop. God knows why, but it would stop. And there was a zillion Italian civilians hopping on the train and riding on the outside of the train, in between the cars and stuff. And there were a bunch of nuns, I remember, hanging onto the outside of the car. And at one point, going through a lot of olive groves and stuff, and at one point, there was a little girl standing on the side of this little hill where the train went through, this little gully like. And she had a little green dress on, and she stood there and just waved. And her house, I guess it was her house, was in the background. And you should see the stuff that GIs threw at her. Candy and cigarettes, and I'll bet her family lived off of what she got. Honest to God, the black market, you could sell a pack of cigarettes for $2 over there. I mean, they were pretty scarce on the black market. She just stood there and waited, and all this stuff came flowing around. The ground was like snow. It was all covered with all that kind of stuff. And then we pulled into a train station, and the zillion little kids run up to the, hey Joe, hey Joe, hey Joe, chocolate Joe. You know. One little kid, I remember, didn't have any foot, and he's stumping around with his foot he lost it somehow with an accident or something. Pathetic little kids, I mean, really. And of course, the GI just threw out all kinds of stuff. At this point, they must have thrown everything away, because every time they saw one of these little kids, they used to throw all the stuff out of candy and stuff. We finally got to a place called, actually it's a place called Gioia, and we didn't go directly to our field. And what they did, they sent a plane down to Gioia, Gioia del Sol is called, and picked us up and flew us back to the base that we were going to be stationed at, which was just outside a town called Canosa de Puglia, which, by the way, is a very famous town. I didn't know it at the time, unfortunately, but in my reading of history since then, the Battle of the very famous Battle of Cannae between, oh gosh, my memory, between the Romans and the who's the guy that brought the elephants? Hannibal. See? The Battle of Hannibal and the Romans was only just a few miles down the river. We were right on that river, and had I known that, I'd have tried to search out the place for it. They had the battle.
So did you stay stationed at Canosa de Puglia for the...
All while I was in Italy. Yep.
And can you tell me about the missions that you flew out of there?
Well, I flew 20 missions, and then the war ended, thank goodness.
Where were your missions usually flown to?
Well, in the first part of the war, they were all up in southern Germany and Austria. I had 3 or 4 missions to Vienna, a couple of missions to Munich. Munich was a bad place, bad place. They used to say that they had all the anti-aircraft instructors up there. They were showing the other guys how to shoot. But I went to Prague one time and bombed the airfield at Prague. And different places. Most of the time we were bombing either railroad yards or oil refineries, and sometimes a factory. Like we bombed the tank factory in Munich, I know, and we bombed another factory, a Messerschmitt factory in Wiener Neustadt. But it was mostly transportation and oil that we were after, apparently, at that time. Then at the end of the war, we bombed in support of our troops. That is, in the spring of 1945, we started the big drive to
And were you flying a B-25 at this time?
No, B-24, 4-engine bomber.
Can you tell me about some of your missions? Can you remember?
Oh yeah, I can remember. Not all of them. They sort of tend to run together. I can't. Sometimes I had a little notebook that I kept while I was there, which said where the mission was and did I get any flak? Did we run into any opposition? Did I lose any engines? You know, that kind of
Do you
thing.
still have that?
Yeah, I had it up until a few years ago, and I went on a vacation to Puerto Rico, and what I did, I'm writing my memoirs, you know, on this thing, and I was down there, and I took this little book down there to help me remember, and I'm writing stuff, and and anyway, to make a long story short, I left it. I took some laundry down at the place we were staying, and they had a laundry room, and I took my notes and I put them over on a table, and then I left and I forgot they were there, and I went back about an hour later and they were gone. And I got the gal that ran the place down there. I told her about it, and they never found them. Somebody threw them away or held them for ransom or something. I don't know what.
Well,
Yeah.
I know that you got some medals while you were there. Do you remember that?
Yeah, we were flying, I think it was to Vienna.
Now, were you still a second lieutenant when you got?
Well, I had 8 missions, 7 missions before my 20th birthday. I was still 19 years old. I was the youngest man in my crew, by the way. The oldest was 22, my engineer. All the other gunners were 20, 21 years old. My co-pilot he was I think 20 or 21. He was older than I was, I know that. And but anyway, I had 7 missions before my 20th birthday. I know that. Which is, by the way, just about this time of year, I was flying my first missions over there. And we were flying, I think it was to Vienna, and we're flying along, and I had to go back to do something. Actually, I went to the restroom back there. And when I got back, my co-pilot had feathered 2 of my engines.
You had done what?
He had feathered them. He had stopped the 2 engines, and he turned feather them. You turn the propellers straight ahead so they don't windmill, you know. And I almost flipped, but I have a picture of that somewhere, by the way. They had what they call weather cameras, and they'd assign weather cameras to certain crews, and on the way up, or any time during the mission, you were supposed to take pictures of the cloud formations, which would help the meteorologist to forecast the weather over enemy territory. Anyway, this guy had one of these, and he took a picture of me with 2 engines feathered as I fell away from the formation. And so anyway, I got back in, and we finally we couldn't get him going again, and so we started to throw things overboard, you know, that kind of stuff, and we finally, by revving up the other 2 engines and stuff, we dumped our bombs and came all the way back.
On only 2 engines?
On 2 engines, yeah.
Why did he ever feather them in the first place?
Well, it was a mechanical failure.
In both engines?
Well, that was part of the problem. He really didn't have to, but I couldn't get him going again. So that was part of. I don't know why I couldn't. What happened? I think to unfeather the engines, you have to use up some oil and stuff, and I couldn't crank them up again for some reason. But anyway, that was kind of hairy coming back. Another time, we were flying a mission to a place called Newburgh, Austria, and we ran into clouds, and it's very hard to fly formation in a cloud. I mean, you're only 50 feet away from this other plane.
Can you tell me what a formation was, like
Well,
the airplanes and how you...
The typical squadron formation, squadron formation, I should say, is like four flights of 6 planes. And you fly, the 6 planes are in groups of, you have a group of 3, and then right behind it, a little below it, you have another group of 3. And so you have a lead plane with 2 wingmen, and then another one below, just behind it, and a little below, another lead plane with 2 wingmen. Then there's another group of 6 up to the right, and another group of 6 down below. So you're sort of staggered. In case of enemy fighters come in, you can all shoot at the same fighter coming in. So I don't remember exactly what position I was in at that point, but I remember going into the cloud, and everybody, the idea when you fly through clouds like that, sometimes you have to, an isolated cloud, but you're supposed to just fly straight ahead. No turns, no up and down. Just to keep your eyes straight ahead, and you know, hope everybody else keeps going straight ahead. And the last thing I saw was a big twin-engine tail in front of me turning to the right. And I thought, this is no place for old Jim. I'll tell you, I'm going to get the hell out of here. So I climbed on up out of the thing. I wasn't going to stick around waiting for somebody to ram me.
Then you got out of formation and went up
yeah,
everybody?
yeah. Well, turned out that everybody else did the same thing. And I got up, well, practically, I got up on top, and I flew around for the clouds. And I flew around for a few minutes waiting for somebody else to come up, because I didn't really want to fly all the way back by myself. This is what the Germans at this point had so few fighter planes left that what they did is they concentrated on the stragglers, that is the guys that were going back with 1 engine out, 2 engines out, or by themselves like I was at that time. And so anyway, I look over and here's another plane comes out of the clouds, and I thought, well, we'll buddy up and go home, because I had no idea how to bomb the target at this point. I probably didn't even have a bombardier. And
Had you dropped the bombs yet?
no, I still had the bombs. And so anyway, we buddied up and started home. And we're over the Alps at this point, by the way. This is clouds over the Alps, and unfortunately, or I don't know. Anyway, I flew on his wing. I let him lead the way. And we're flying a straight line, you know, which is stupid. But this was only probably my 5th mission or so. I wasn't really very experienced at that point. And we're flying along straight and level. And what do? We cross an enemy town at the bottom of the Brenner Pass. Now, the Brenner Pass was a railroad line between Austria and Italy, and they had anti-aircraft guns that whole way. I mean, it was a vital link to the two. And so anyway, we flew across that, and boy, the first thing I know, there's a zillion anti-aircraft shells bursting right in front of us.
And it was just you 2 planes?
Just us 2. And I picked up 250 holes in about 30 seconds, you know. And it was banging around in the plane. But anyway, I got out of there in a hurry, as you might expect. But that was pretty stupid of me to be flying straight. You know, at least you ought to turn once in a while, you know, to make it a little more difficult. See, they were firing their guns by radar too. They could see through the clouds, just like we could bomb through the clouds. Yeah, I had another the closest call really I had. I lost altogether, I think, 8 engines to flak, or one thing or another. And some of the planes that I flew, of course, the new pilots got all the old planes. This is only fair. I mean, a guy that's got 30, 40 missions doesn't want to fly the old clunkers. Let the new guys fly those. And some of those were pretty war weary. At the end of the war, they'd had a lot of missions, and the engines were pretty worn. And so a lot of times you'd fly and you lose an engine just because it was worn out or whatever. No enemy action at all. It would just, you just lose all the oil or some such thing. And so altogether, I think I lost 8 engines. But you know, I never thought that was a big deal, because I'd practiced that so much in training that, so you lose an engine, you feather it and fly back. And the plane flew pretty well on 3 engines. Not as well as B-17, for example. That was a lot easier to fly than a B-24, but nevertheless, it flew pretty well.
What would a typical mission be like time-wise and what you drop for bombs?
Well, you get up, a typical mission would be, you get up like 4 o'clock in the morning or so, and go to breakfast. And one of the things you had to be careful of in the spring in Italy was mud. I mean, mud all over the place. You've probably seen some war pictures of jeeps stuck in the mud. Well, that was all over, and we had stones between our house and our tent rather, and the mess hall and stuff. But if you slipped off the stones, you went up to your knee in mud, and that happened. The guys would get mud, and then they'd fly all day with a damn wet foot. But anyway, get up then, go to breakfast, come back, go to a briefing where they would tell you what the mission was, where you were going to go, what all the details were, the call signs, and what time you should start your engines, and all that kind of stuff, and what kind of opposition you could expect that day, and you know, all that stuff. And if you couldn't make the target, what were your alternate targets that you could bomb? They had this all printed up on what they call a flimsy, and they'd hand that out to all the pilots. And so then you'd hop in your, of course, by this time you got your parachute and your oxygen mask and all that stuff with you. So you'd hop in the truck that take you down to the planes. The living area at our base was on top of a hill, and the field was down in a valley below the hill, I'd say about a mile away. And so you'd hop in the truck, and they'd take you down to the field and take you to your plane, and then you'd get in the plane and check the plane out, go through a pre-flight check, you know, see everything looked all right. And at time of the engines start up, you'd start up your engines and check those out, make sure that everything was running all right. And then you'd look at the tower and wait for a signal from the tower. And what they used to do is, if the mission was on, they'd fire a green flare. And if the mission was on hold, that is, you were not going to go when you were supposed to go, they'd fire a single red flare. And if the mission was canceled because of weather, usually, they'd fire what they call a double red, 2 red flares. And if they ever fired the double red, you should hear the cheering going up all over the field. Now, it's not that we were unpatriotic, but you know, it's the end of the war, and you don't really need another mission. But anyway, then after if it's a green flare, you taxi out and in order. That is, I knew that I had to follow the certain plane, and the planes were identified by letters on the side of the plane. And
Do you remember what your plane was?
Well, it was different planes all the time.
Oh, you never had the same.
Never had, well, you might have the same plane twice, but it was coincidence. As I said, I only flew, well, the first 7 missions took me a month, and that was because weather intervened, and they had more crews than they had planes. And so you probably could plan to fly every 3rd or 4th day. I don't know that a pilot really could stand flying every day, because these are 8-10-hour missions, and when you get back, you're really exhausted. The 324 was not an easy plane to fly, and you really had to fly it. I mean, you're in formation all the time, and you were really actively, physically flying this thing. And some planes were really bad. we had a plane called White K. It had a white K on the side, and it was a dog. I mean, God, you'd come back and you were absolutely physically whipped. The controls were hard and it didn't react right, you know, and you're trying to fly formation, and oh boy, really tough. So when you get out of in fact, when you got coming back from a mission, when you got back over Italy where it was fairly safe, I used to just pull out of the formation and not even try to fly formation, just fly over to the side where you didn't have to beat your brains out keeping that thing in formation. But anyway, then after you found your spot in the line of planes, they would then taxi around to the takeoff end of the runway. We only had one runway. It ran east and west, and they'd line up two on a runway, and then you'd get a green light from the tower, a green signal light, and they would go. And the other guy sitting next to him would start revving up his engines, and there'd be another plane pull up next to him on the side, waiting his turn. So you had two on the end of the runway all the time. So the plane got about halfway down the runway, you'd get a green light from the tower on the other plane, and he'd then go, and so on. So when your turn to go, by this time your throttles are wide open, and the plane is shaking like crazy, and you're holding with the brakes, and so then you'd let the brakes off, and you'd start to roll. And of course, you had 2,700 gallons of gas, and you had a full load of bombs, lots of ammunition, 50 caliber ammunition. And so you're pretty heavy. And so you'd accelerate not too rapidly, and our field was 5,000 feet long or so, and about halfway down it had a big dip. And so the plane ahead of you, when you look at him from the ground, he'd disappear. You could remember it's an old farm field that they laid this steel matting on and made an airfield on it, and so he'd go out of sight, and then he'd come back up on the other side and finally take off. But you're so heavy that it took you all the 5,000 feet to get off. And I remember one time I was what they call air officer, and my job was to be in the tower when these planes took off. 20 years old, I'm an air officer. And I couldn't believe how many planes went off the end of the runway into the dirt before they got off the ground. Anyway, one day I took off, and the plane ahead of me went off the end of the runway, and he must have hit something or something, and his landing gear collapsed. And he skidded along, I don't know, a few hundred feet, and tipped up on his nose. So his plane, the tail is sticking up in the air. And here I am, by this time, remember, I started, when he was halfway down the runway, I started. And by this time, I'm rolling, and I can't stop. And he's standing off the end of the runway, and I how the hell am I going to get by this guy? And I just kept going, and finally I lifted my wing over his tail and kept on going. I had more trouble, closer to being killed, things like that, than I did in combat, really, as far as I know, anyway. Another time, the same thing, not the same thing, but at the same general circumstance, I was flying around. when you formed up the formation, the lead planes flew what they call a racetrack pattern around the field, and the ones behind them, since they took off at different times, it took a while to get them into formation. So the way they did that is that the lead plane would fly around, the ones behind them would cut inside them all the time, you know, and so catch up with them. And finally you'd get your planes all in form. And then the bigger groups, the squadrons, would do the same thing, and the big groups would be assembled until you had maybe 1,000 planes in formation. But I was I was scheduled to fly the number 5 position, and this other guy was supposed to fly number 6, which is the 2 wing positions in the second element. And the number 4 guy had engine problems or something, and he didn't take off. And so now one of us should go into this 4th position. So the other guy would fly on his wing. Normally it's the 5th guy, he's the number, would move up into that position, because I took off before this other guy did. And so I'm planning on moving up into the 4th position. And around the field, they had some hills that were, I don't know, maybe 500, 600, 800 feet high. And we're only at 1,000 feet normally, you know, at this point. And so as you fly over these hills, you're only a few hundred feet over the hill. And all of a sudden, I'm headed for this 4th slot. And this number 6 guy comes up and he pulls up right in front of me, right in front of me. I mean, like 20, 30 feet away, I swear. And stupid me, I pulled my throttles because I didn't want to chew off his tail. But I'm only 300 feet off the ground because the hill is right underneath me. And I look down and I'm settling down into the hill. You know. Anyway, I'm here, so I obviously made it. But those close calls, you know, put years on your life.
Were there any casualties in your school?
Never, thank God. That was one of my biggest fears, that somebody would get hurt and I wouldn't know what to do. Although we always had Red Cross training, you know, but I was always panicky that somebody would really get hurt. Closest call we had was well, a couple of close calls. My tail gunner one time heard a clang, and a piece of flak, or yeah, I guess it must have been flak, hit his tail turret and bounced up through the top of it. And he looked up like that to see, and a piece of flak came through and cut his throat mic cord about 2 inches from his throat. So had he not done that, it would have gone right through the side of his face. Another one was we were flying, and flak was bursting all around, and I heard this clang, and I get a call from my nose gunner, I guess it was a bombardier, saying, I've been hit. So I called the nose gunner and told him to check out the bombardier to see what his problem was. And what had happened, a piece of flak had come along, and the reinforcing frame of the B-24 is like angle iron, you know. It's painted green. And what happened, the flak had come in and run along this angle iron and threw all the paint in this guy's face. It didn't hit him, it just threw all the paint in his face. And he heard the clang and stuff. And he couldn't see, so he said, I've been hit. So they told the nose gunner to get out and check him, and he calls back up. He's hell, he's not hit. He just got paint in his eyes. That's all. But that same hunk, it turned out to be a half of a base of a shell. It hit the edge of the plane. Had it been like 6 inches over and about 6 inches up, it would have caught me right in the face. But 6 inches over and 6 inches down.
I know that you got some medals. Will you tell me which medals you got and how you got
Well,
them?
the air medal at DFC I got for bringing that plane back, and
DFC being
the Distinguished Flying Cross.
That's for bringing that plane back.
Yeah,
with only 2 engines.
and the other was the 4 air medals was every 5 minutes you got an air medal, like automatically. Yeah, you don't have to do anything, just fly 5. Nothing super anyway.
All right, life in the service. How did you stay in touch with your family?
I got more letters than anybody in the whole squadron. I swear to God. Yeah, my mother and my sisters, and a couple of girlfriends, and my brothers. Of course, that means I had to write a lot of letters too. But I remember when I first got over there was a delay, and your mail has to catch up with it, And one day I'd get 30 letters, the next day I'd get 40 letters, really, because of the delay, of the accumulation. But I got a letter from one girl like every day, and my mother used to write every other day or so. And she saved all my letters, by the way.
She did?
Yeah, I have, except for the ones I lost down in Puerto Rico. I have all the letters I wrote her, which is, by the way, one of my sources for my memoirs. Yeah, thank goodness she saved them all.
Now, when you were in Italy, you lived in a tent?
Yeah.
What was barracks life like?
Oh, not bad. When I first got there, they gave us a tent. They had already pitched a tent. And they said, "This is your tent." No heat, nothing, no floor. And they pitched it out in the middle of the mud. Remember I told you about the mud? So we couldn't sleep in it. I mean, there's no way you could walk around in that mud. And so the guy next door was good enough to put us up for a few nights in his tent, which makes, now these tents are only 16 by 16, so now you got 6 guys in a 16 by 16 tent. His 3 crew and mine. But what we did is we made up our own heater, and you could go down into the engineering people down in the field, and they would cut a 55-gallon drum in half, and tip it upside down, and where the opening in the drum was, you'd put some kind of a stovepipe. We made a stovepipe out of some rolled up corrugated steel that we found down there. We tied it up with wire and ran it up through the top of the tent, and we burned 100-octane gasoline to heat our tent. Every day they drain the tanks of these planes, because water condenses in the tank and it always settles to the bottom. So there's a drain spot on the tank, and they drain out all this water. Well, they can't always, I mean, there's some gas in there too. So they would deliver this gas up to, we had a tank outside the tent. We took some tubing from wrecked planes, ran it into the turned over 55-gallon drum, and pinched the end of the tubing so that it squirted the gas into a pan of sand, and we had our fire. And so we went down and got, the next day we went down and got that and rigged it up, turned on the fire, and dried out all the mud in the tent, and then we moved in. Later on, a month or two after that, we found out that a lot of the guys had built walls of this so-called tufa. It's limestone they dig out of the ground over there, and it's soft, but they leave it out in the sun. It's like a cinder block here, about that size. They build all their houses out of it. And so we hired a local guy to make these walls out of this tufa. I got a truck from the base and went out there and picked up the tufa and delivered it up there, and he built the walls, and we whitewashed the walls, and then we took 2 tents and put it up over the top. So we had a tent for the roof and tufa walls for the thing. And that way it was a lot better, because now we could have like 6-foot-high walls, where otherwise the tent only had like 3-foot-high walls. And so you weren't running around bent over all the time inside the tent.
And how many months did you say you were in Italy?
Well, I was there from December to June.
December of 44?
To June of 45. About 6 months. From after the war was over, we went to a place called Ora down in the Gulf of Taranto. I don't know why, but we just went down there and sat there for a week or two. I mean, I don't know there must have been a reason, obviously, but I don't know what it was. And
where you were when you heard that the war was over?
Oh yeah.
Where were you?
Well, in my little tent.
Do you remember what your feelings were like then?
Well, I was very happy, but I was also a little fearful because the guys were running around shooting off their guns.
In celebration?
In celebration, honest to God. I remember being, geez, I'm not going to go out there with all these clowns. I don't know how much they've had to drink or anything else. They're banging away with their 45s, you know. We all had 45s, of course. We carried them in a shoulder holster when we went on our missions and stuff.
So then you went to ORA, O-R-A?
Yeah, that's as I remember it. I can't find it on the map, so I don't know whether that was just a bad recollection on my part or whether it was just a little settlement of some kind. But we went down there for just a week or two. One thing I remember about that, though, is that they had an orphanage down there and run by some nuns, and somebody heard about it, and so my crew, at least the officers of my crew, went up to visit them, and we gave them some money, and that's how they survived, from gifts from the GIs. And I'll tell you, they had a little box, and they took us around, and all these beautiful little kids, they took us around the place. It was spotless, you know, and they all lined up and thanked us and all. And they had a box at the door there, and it was stuffed with $20 bills, you know, 20 lira bills, which must have kept them going in pretty good shape. And in fact, the other thing that they did, I remember some of the guys, I didn't, but some of the guys went into our PX and bought soap and things like that and brought that up to them.
Wow. And how soon after that did you rotate home to the United States?
Then within a week or two, I can't remember how long I was there. It wasn't very long. We went to back to this Joya de Sol place, which was, that's spelled G-I-O-I, how do you spell it? G-I-A-O-A, something like that. And anyway, that's where we were to pick up our plane to fly home. And I'm sitting in the bar up there, 20-year-old drinking. And this guy came in that I had been in cadets with. And yeah, we had a big old reunion, you know, sat down. Turns out he's the guy who test flies all the planes before they get sent home. You know, if there's any repair or anything done, he checks them out to make sure that they're all right before they give them to another crew to fly home. That was his job. He says, he says, when are you flying home? I said, I don't know, today or tomorrow, whatever. He says, I'll tell you what, he says, I got a brand new plane, just came over. Never flown in combat. Perfect. And it's got 80 hours on it, he says. He said, I'll make sure you get it.
To take back to the
United States. Because remember now, I've got to fly the Atlantic, you know. And I didn't want one of those, I didn't want White K to fly the Atlantic. And that's true. Brand new B-24M, the latest model, radar, it's got all the...
Is that what you flew home?
That's what I flew home.
With your crew?
With my crew. And they had taken my navigator off earlier. They made him a lead navigator for the squadron. He was an excellent navigator. And as I said, I really didn't need one anyway because we're mostly in formation. And so I didn't have a navigator at that point. So they assigned a navigator to me, a kid named Epstein, who then was my navigator on the flight home. And I flew from Italy down to, supposedly, to Casablanca. And when I got down in that general area, they diverted me to a place called Port Lyautey, L-Y-A-U-T-E-Y, because Casablanca had a big sandstorm. And well, it turned out Port Lyautey had a big sandstorm too, and I'm flying around and I can't see the ground very well. Except that ahead of me I see a consolidated Catalina, which is a Navy plane, lands on water. I figured, well, I'll follow him. He can land either way, so I'll follow him around. He knows the place. He's been here before. I follow him around, and he starts to let down, and I start to let down, except he's landing in the bay, and I can't see the ground all that well. So anyway, I finally found the field and landed, and they had to give me some more gas because I didn't have enough to get down to Casablanca. So they gave me some gas, and I waited for a couple, 3 hours, and the sandstorm dissipated or ran out, and then I flew on down to Casablanca. Casablanca, I stayed overnight there, and we stayed in the Italian embassy. They had taken over the Italian embassy. And I had my flight suit on, and I folded it up, and I put it on a radiator. They didn't have anything else to put it on. And next morning I got up and put it on and went out and got in the plane, and we flew down to where? Dakar. And I stayed overnight there, and I had a little problem with the airplane, so they had to check some things and replace it. By the way, they had these Senegalese guards for the planes down there. These guys were walking around in this hot amosite, you know, and that gets hotter than heck, with no shoes. And I couldn't understand how they could walk around with those. Anyway, the next day I took off and flew across the Atlantic. I've got to be one of the youngest pilots that ever flew the Atlantic. I was only 20 years old, and 20 years and 4 months or so. But you know, you think about that. They don't let 20-year-olds do a lot of things. And here I was flying around the world. Anyway, I got to Brazil, flying through some thunderstorms on the way over. And it wasn't too scary. It was just, you know, it was scary because there's nothing but water underneath you, but we didn't have any problems, thank God. The brand new plane, everything ran well. Finally got to Brazil. Couldn't see the ground, no clouds all over the place. And I began to wonder what I was going to do, and all of a sudden there was a hole in the clouds and I could see the ground, but it was kind of small, so I decided I was going to really go down fast down through this hole to get down on the ground. And as I got down to landing on the field, these squalls were coming across the field, and on my final approach, squall came across the field, and the guy in the tower couldn't see me. And all of a sudden he said, I talked to him later, he said, I thought you were going to fly around, and I'd just flown the Atlantic, and I wasn't, I wanted to get that damn thing down to the ground as fast as I could. So I just kept going, and here I finally landed the damn thing. He said, I thought you were a damn idiot. He says, you should have gone around. Anyway, next day, and then I went to buy something in the PX there to bring home to my folks and stuff, my sisters, and I reached for my wallet, no wallet. And I didn't know what the hell happened to it. I went out in the plane, I looked for it, and anyway, no wallet. The end of that story is, when I got out of the Air Force, I went to the University of Arizona. And this is a year later, in the spring. And I suddenly get a letter from the Army saying that they found my wallet.
Where?
In the Italian embassy. It had fallen down in back of that radiator. And it had like $300 in it, which is now worth $1,500, I don't know, whatever. And some sergeant had found it, converted the money into postal money orders, and sent it along. Would you believe that? And it had followed me all over the place, and finally they found out I was at Arizona, and they sent it to me. And so I responded, and they finally sent me the money orders. Wow. Isn't that something? They sent me the wallet, too.
Do you recall your last day in service?
Where was it? Yes, sure. Well, after I landed from Brazil, I flew up to Puerto Rico, And then from Puerto Rico, I flew back up to Savannah. And I left home, I left Savannah, went home on 40-day leave, and went back to Tampa, Florida, where I was assigned to B-29 school. And that school was at Savannah again, so I flew up to Savannah and started B-29 training, because the war in Japan wasn't over at that point. So I was going to be a B-29 pilot, which I didn't like at all. It was a much bigger plane than the B-24, much slower reaction. I mean, the B-24 felt like a fighter plane compared to that thing. And I didn't like that at all. But fortunately, I only had 2 flights in it, and the war ended in Japan. And I remember that too, because I was in a movie theater, and they stopped the movie to announce that, on the base, and they stopped the movie to announce the end of the war. And so my co-pilot said, "Let's go into town." I said, "Oh, hell no, everybody's going to be in town." So he went into town, and he said there were free drinks and everything, and I stayed home. A good little boy. I went to bed and didn't do a damn thing. But then from there, I was waiting for reassignment, and I got reassigned to a reconnaissance squadron flying A-26s, which is a twin-engine, really fast twin-engine reconnaissance plane in Texas. And I'm just as happy as a clam, because now I'm finally going to get my wish to fly a real good, fast, hot airplane. About 2 hours after that, this sergeant comes looking for me. They've changed my orders. Now I'm going to fly B-24s again. And I'm going to be the personal pilot for the head of the Army Airways Communications System. Now, the Army Air Force had a whole bunch of communications centers all over the world, and this guy was in charge of these things, and he's a colonel. And he would fly checking him out from this base to that base to whatever. And my job was to fly him around. Well, the B-24, is not a good plane to fly over a lot of water. I mean, it sinks like a stone. For one thing, you land the thing in the water, and it immediately breaks in half at the bomb bay. And the water just comes in, and down it goes. And boy, I didn't want that worth a damn. But I couldn't get out of it. They sent me to Shepherd Field for some reason. And down there, I went through this processing to go overseas again, and this sergeant said to me, he says, "You'll have to sign this waiver." And I said, "What waiver is that?" And he says, "Well, you've been overseas once." He said, "You'll have to sign a waiver to go overseas again." I said, "I'm not going to sign any damn waiver not to fly that B-24 around over the Pacific Ocean all the time." And he said, "Well, you can't go overseas then." So then they sent me out to Santa Ana. And this was, by this time, you see, I'd been transferred out of the main. Actually, at this point, I was really thinking about staying in. I love to fly, and that'd be a great career. But now I'm out of the main line. I'm out of the combat line. I'm out of the flying. Now I'm off into the communications side of the thing. And they sent me out to Santa Ana, the headquarters of this 55th Wing, I guess it is. And they had me sitting at a desk inspecting enlisted men's pay records. And I was there for 2 months, and I finally, I could only get 4 hours of flying in a month to get my flight pay. And I thought, the heck with this, I'm not gonna stick this out. So I got out at Santa Ana, California. And I went to the University of Arizona just in time to get into the spring semester. Yeah.
This is going to be the end for the Library of Congress, but let me finish the tape because I still haven't finished all the questions. because they'll cut it off probably. Did you stay in touch with any of your Air Force?
Well, you know, I tried for years and years to get a hold of them. I wrote to different search outfits and got names and addresses and phone numbers and stuff. And I went through phone books and stuff. And I only located 4 of my crew. One of them died, quite young. My belly gunner, who was afraid to get into his belly turret, by the way. I don't blame him. It's a scary damn place down there. My tail gunner stayed in the air while he got out and became a teacher, decided that teaching wasn't his cup of tea. He got back into the Air Force during the Korean War and ended up as a colonel. My radio operator, I got a hold of him, and Pat Maloney, good Irishman from Boston. He was an accountant in New York City for a bunch of doctors down there, and I visited him out in California, out in Palm Springs. And my co-pilot, I finally got a hold of my co-pilot. With a name like Clyde Dubbs, you'd think that I'd have no problem at all getting a hold of him. But I finally got a hold of him, and he's retired down in Florida. He went to work for the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, in charge of their tower operators, you know, the guys that talk planes into coming in. And he was down in the administrative offices in Washington. Drives a big Cadillac around. So I got a hold of 4 of them. My tail gunner, my belly gunner, but I did see my engineer once. When I went to San Diego State, he stopped in to see me. He was on his way back to Houston. He's from Houston. And he had become, after the war, he had gone to work for United Airlines as a maintenance guy. And he ran their maintenance operation up in San Francisco. A very talented guy. I mean, just the smartest guy. We used to go to class together because pilots and engineers went to certain technical classes together, like how the carburetor works and all that stuff. And he used to end up teaching the class. I mean, he'd correct the instructor, kind of thing. So anyway, but I never could get a hold of him afterward. I heard, he told me he was going to go to Houston to set up his own company down there to repair airplanes and stuff. But I could never find him. I called 50, his name was Gonzalez in Texas. So I bet I called 50 Gonzalez's in Texas, half of whom could hardly speak understandable English, but I never could find him.
After the service, you said you went to the University of Arizona?
Yeah, and then there I transferred because of my girlfriend that I met when I was in Tucson. And then she went home to San Diego, so I decided to transfer to San Diego State.
And did you graduate from San Diego State?
No, I didn't. She told me to get lost. And I came home to Connecticut. I graduated from the University of Connecticut.
So, okay, so you went to University of Arizona, to San Diego State, to UConn?
Yep.
And you graduated with what degree from UConn?
BS degree in business administration. I started out to be an engineer in Arizona and stuff, and aeronautical engineer, in fact. And 1948, I was in San Diego, and they fired 500 aeronautical engineers from Consolidated, and I thought, oh, that's not the career for me. So I switched to business.
Was your education supported by the GI Bill?
Yes, yes, yes. Worked out very well.
And what did you go on to do as a career?
Well, I went to work for Travelers and in their data processing department. Then I took some graduate work at MIT and Columbia in computer science at Travelers' expense. And then I ended up running their data processing operation.
And how many years were you at Travelers?
29 years. I retired at 55. They offered me a golden handshake.
And you took it.
Yeah, that's when of course, at this time I had purchased the property here. I had 37 acres here. And I decided, well, I'll mess around with the farm. And I put up a greenhouse, and we sold things off the farm. Strawberries, I had strawberry things. And then Tom, my son, got out of the Air Force in 1983, and we decided to go into business together. So we put up more greenhouses, and we put up a store and stuff. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about military in general?
Well, I read a great deal, and a lot of what I read is historical stuff, and especially when I read about how politicians manipulate the population to achieve their ends, and how how their mistakes, or maybe they're not mistakes, they could be, but they might have been intentional, how their mistakes have a very unhealthy effect on people, soldiers and stuff. I'm becoming a little more skeptical about wars in general. Although I was always very patriotic. I always felt I had an obligation to defend my country. But then when you see what the politicians do, you wonder if you're really defending your country or you're just achieving their political ends. It makes you wonder.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I'm a member of the VFW and also the American Legion. I am not active, however, in either one of them. But I pay my dues. And
Have you attended any reunions?
yes, several. We have one every year, and have had for the last 20 years or so. I haven't gone to all of them because sometimes they happen at the wrong time, but I've been to many of them. But they're kind of disappointing. For one thing, I was there at the end of the war, and a lot of these guys were there earlier in the war, and so I have no idea who they are. And so I don't really have a lot in common with these people. And the other side of it is, I don't know. They're still. They don't seem to mix very well. I mean, I don't know whether it's because their careers weren't very successful. I don't know what it is, but sometimes it's kind of hard to socialize with some of these people.
How did your service and experiences affect your life?
Well, it took 3 years out of my life to begin with. Oh, a great deal. I really, aside from the time that people were shooting at me, I really enjoyed my military. I can't say that I didn't enjoy any part of it except for that. Even the parts that, where you weren't living under the best conditions and stuff, that never bothered me a damn bit. I didn't have half the a fraction of the problems that the poor GIs had, the infantry guys had. I always came back to a nice, clean house, at the night. Really, it's hot showers. You can't complain. But it certainly affected my life. I would not have gone to the University of Arizona. I would not have gone to San Diego State. I wouldn't have had half the experiences that I've had.
Did you feel pressure or stress when you were in Italy, when you were flying on missions?
Oh yeah, I lost 28 pounds.
Really?
Yeah, when I came back, you know, I didn't think so at the time, you know, but you don't sleep very well, especially before a mission. And sometimes after a mission, you don't sleep very well, especially if you've had some problems. And you know, you're flying over there, and you're flying over the Alps on 3 engines, and you're dying a horrible death because what if one of them quits, and you're going to end up in the Alps, you know, that kind of thing. And now you're in enemy territory. Anyway, when I came back, since I lost my wallet in Casablanca, I had to get a new ID card. And so I went over, and so when I landed in Savannah, I had to go over to another Army base to get this ID card. And so I'm filling out the questionnaire, or the girl is filling out this questionnaire to type up for the ID card. And she said, "When were you born?" And I said, 1925. And of course, this was 1945. And she said, no, when were you born? And I said, 1925. She said, "You're only 20 years old." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "God, I thought you were 28. I must have looked kind of weary, haggard.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No.
Other experiences?
Oh, I could talk for another 4 or 5 hours about some of the things that happened to me or to my crew, or, you know. But I think that covers it pretty well. As I say, I always wanted to be a pilot. I got my wish. I got all the flying that I needed to fly. I haven't flown. I've flown once since then. That is, flown my own plane once since then. Well, when I was in school, I didn't have enough money to rent a plane. And then as you get older, you get married, and you know, you got other things to do. So I got flying out of my system, so to speak. But I always loved to fly, and I still like to fly commercially. You know.
You think you could get into a B-24 today and fly it?
Yeah, I bet you. It'll take me a little while to get used to things again. I did, you know, Pat's brother Jack, my wife's brother Jack, was a pilot for American Airlines. And by the way, I applied to the airlines when I got out. Of course, they had a zillion guys applying for the airlines. I applied for Delta down in Florida, and I felt how old I was, 20 years old. And she said, "Well, we're really looking for somebody a little bit older, a little more mature." Can you imagine a 20-year-old flying? Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, Pat's brother Jack, he and some of his other American airline pilots bought a PT-17, which I had flown in primary. And he took us for a ride down in Oxford, Connecticut. And so I did get a chance to fly an old PT-17 again. It was different from what I remembered. It was stiffer than what I remember. It took more strength than maybe because I was getting weaker or something. But I bet I could fly a B-24 again. I'd be scared to death to do it. You know, the other day I was reading a book about a fighter squadron in England, and they were describing what was happening to the bombers that they were escorting, and it scared me to death. The things that were happening to those bombers were also happening to me, but I didn't realize how bad it was at the time. You know, when you're in the service like that and it's happening, you always think it's the other guy that's going to get killed or get shot down. Never you, never me. I never, ever, ever thought I was going to get shot down. I was always going to bring it back.
And you did.
Well, I had, you know, I had a couple of experiences. I lost a couple of engines in training one time in Tucson, and I landed it. I brought it back, and they had the whole runway lined up with firefighting equipment. They thought I was going to crash. Well, you know, training pilots are not so experienced. And I get down to the end of the runway, and I couldn't taxi because I only had 2 engines. And the colonel from the base came out in his staff car, puts his arm around me. Great landing, son, great landing. He said, we were taking pictures of it. They're taking movies of it because they thought I was going to crash, you know. And he said, great, good job, you know. So that, after that, it got around and I brought this plane back with 2 engines, and I bet I had 20 guys from other crews come up to me and ask me if they could get on
Your crew.
my crew. One guy was in tears practically. He says, my pilot's going to kill me. He said, every time I go up, he said, I'm scared to death. I think it was more him than his pilot, but I didn't want him on my crew either. But I had a lot of guys come up and say, can I get on your crew? Is there anybody you don't want on your crew?
Did you do anything for good luck?
No, not consciously. That is, I wore a miraculous medal and a St. Christopher's medal, but you know, I didn't have any rabbit's foot, or I didn't go through any routine that some guys used to go through. A lot of guys used to, you know, have all kinds of little habits that they always wore the same thing all the time. I never had any of that stuff. I never believed in that kind of stuff, except the miraculous medal.
Well, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time.
Oh,
and
no
story
problem.
with us.
I'd love to do it.